Good evening. I'm here to provide you with a comprehensive analysis of one of the most significant political developments of early 2026, an announcement that has sent shockwaves through both the federal government and state capitals across America, particularly in California. On February 4th, 2026, news broke that Vice President JD Vance will lead a newly established White House anti-fraud task force with California as its primary target. This isn't merely another bureaucratic reshuffling or routine oversight initiative. This represents a calculated political maneuver with implications that extend far beyond government accounting, touching on the 2026 midterm elections, the 2028 presidential race, and the fundamental dynamics of federal-state relations in an increasingly polarized America. The announcement, which broke through CBS News and rapidly circulated across social media, garnering over 1.1 million views on a single post by conservative commentator Benny Johnson, signals the Trump administration's intention to wage what they frame as a war on waste, fraud, and abuse in taxpayer-funded programs. But as we'll explore today, the reality is far more complex, and the political calculations behind this move are multi-layered and consequential. Let's begin with the mechanics of what's being proposed. According to multiple sources briefed on the planning, President Trump intends to sign an executive order in the coming days, possibly within this week, though the timeline remains fluid, formally establishing this anti-fraud task force with Vice President Vance serving as chairman. The appointment of a sitting vice president to lead such an initiative is significant. It's designed to signal that this isn't a peripheral concern but a top-tier priority for the administration. Vance, who already serves as vice chair of the White House task forces for the 2026 FIFA World Cup and the 2028 Summer Olympics, as well as finance chair for the Republican National Committee, will add this high-profile assignment to an already substantial portfolio. The task force's vice chairman will be Andrew Ferguson, the current chairman of the Federal Trade Commission. Ferguson, who was originally nominated by President Biden and sworn in as an FTC commissioner in April 2024, brings significant consumer protection credentials to this role. Under his leadership, the FTC has continued major litigation against tech giants, including Amazon's $2.5 billion settlement in September and ongoing appeals in the case against Meta for allegedly breaking antitrust laws when acquiring Instagram and WhatsApp. Ferguson will manage both the FTC and the daily operations of the task force, a dual role that speaks to the administration's ambition, but also raises questions about bandwidth and potential conflicts of interest. The third key player is Colin McDonald, nominated by Trump for a newly created fraud investigator position at the Justice Department. McDonald will report to Attorney General Pam Bondi and Deputy AG Todd Blanche, but will work closely with Vance and Ferguson. This organizational structure is already triggering concerns from Democrats and watchdog organizations about whether the White House could exert political pressure on McDonald to investigate the administration's political opponents. The question everyone is asking, why California? The answer lies in a combination of legitimate fraud concerns and unmistakable political calculation. Let's address the substantive issues first. California has experienced documented significant fraud in several major programs, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. The state's Employment Development Department admitted in 2021 that approximately $20 billion was lost due to fraud, largely in the federal Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program. To put that in perspective, that's more than the annual budget for NASA. The California State Auditor has issued repeated warnings about agencies at high risk for waste, fraud, abuse, or mismanagement. A December 2025 audit found that the EDD's inadequate fraud prevention during the pandemic led to billions in questionable payments. The state itself acknowledged in 2021 that it failed to implement precautions other states had adopted, including cross-referencing benefit claims against prison inmate databases. A stunning oversight that allowed incarcerated individuals to fraudulently receive unemployment benefits. California auditors have also discovered billions in fraudulent claims related to pandemic assistance and healthcare programs. The hospice fraud scandal, first exposed by the Los Angeles Times in 2020, revealed networks of bogus hospice providers draining Medicare and Medicaid resources, an issue that Attorney General Rob Bonta has since pursued, filing criminal charges against 109 individuals. But here's the crucial context. California has also been actively addressing these issues. The EDD reports recovering more than $6 billion in stolen unemployment funds, opening over 2,300 fraud investigations, leading to nearly 1,000 arrests and more than 670 convictions. Governor Newsom implemented a moratorium on new hospice programs in 2021 and shuttered 280 suspect operations. Newsom's office claims the state has blocked over $125 billion in fraud overall. The political calculation becomes evident when we examine what the task force isn't focusing on. Fraud in government programs is not unique to California or Democratic-led states. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services has placed 6 states under enhanced monitoring for hospice fraud and waste: California, Arizona, Nevada, Texas, Ohio, and Georgia, a mix of red and blue states. Yet the administration's rhetoric has been laser-focused on Democratic strongholds, particularly California and Minnesota. Minnesota's massive child care fraud scandal involving tens of millions in stolen welfare funds contributed to Governor Tim Walz's stunning decision to drop his 2026 re-election bid. To understand the significance of Vance's appointment, we need to examine the historical evolution of vice presidential power and task force leadership. The vice presidency has transformed dramatically over the past half-century. Early vice presidents focused primarily on their constitutional role as president of the Senate. John Adams famously described the position as the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. The modern, influential vice presidency really emerged in the 1970s with Walter Mondale under President Carter, who established the precedent of the VP as a close presidential advisor with an office in the West Wing. But the template for vice presidents leading major policy initiatives came from 2 recent office holders, Al Gore and Dick Cheney. Al Gore chaired Clinton's National Performance Review aimed at reinventing government and became the administration's point person on environmental policy and technology initiatives. Dick Cheney, widely considered the most powerful vice president in American history, led the Energy Task Force and wielded extraordinary influence over foreign policy and national security during the Bush administration. More recently, Joe Biden served as Obama's chief liaison to Congress and led task forces on gun violence prevention and cancer research, the so-called Cancer Moonshot Initiative. These precedents established that vice presidents could serve as effective policy drivers on specific priority issues. Vance is following this model, but with a distinctly partisan edge. His existing roles, chairing Olympic and World Cup task forces while serving as RNC finance chair, already blur the lines between governance and politics more explicitly than his predecessors. Adding leadership of an anti-fraud task force targeting Democratic-led states escalates this pattern significantly. Now let's address the institutional concerns that legal scholars, former federal prosecutors, and government watchdogs are raising. First, there's the question of the task force's relationship to existing Justice Department infrastructure. The DOJ already maintains robust fraud enforcement capabilities, including the Criminal Division's Fraud Section, the Civil Division's Commercial Litigation Branch, and fraud units in U.S. attorneys' offices across the country. According to CBS News sources, the new task force could sidestep these existing units. One source suggested this arrangement stems from frustration with resistance from career staff who disagree with some of Trump's priorities and tactics. This is concerning on multiple levels. Career prosecutors are meant to provide institutional continuity and independence from political pressure, exactly the kind of insulation that prevents investigations from becoming partisan weapons. The structure also raises separation of powers questions. While Colin McDonald will technically report to the Attorney General, his mandate to work closely with Vance and Ferguson, both political appointees with explicitly political roles, creates potential for what legal experts call undue political influence over prosecutorial decisions. Former federal prosecutors I've consulted with point out that investigative decisions should be driven by evidence and legal merit, not political targeting. When a vice president who simultaneously serves as RNC finance chair and is actively involved in partisan messaging oversees fraud investigations targeting opposition party governors, the appearance of politicization is unavoidable regardless of what evidence ultimately emerges. There are also practical questions about accountability and oversight. Who will oversee the task force's activities? Will Congress exercise meaningful oversight, or will this break along partisan lines? Will the Government Accountability Office be able to audit the task force's findings and methodologies? Now let's discuss what this is really about: politics. Gavin Newsom is widely viewed as a leading contender for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2028. He's positioned himself as one of Trump's most vocal critics, running advertisements in red states defending California's policies and challenging Republican governance. The targeting of California for fraud investigation, regardless of the underlying merits, serves multiple political purposes for Republicans. First, it feeds a long-standing conservative narrative about California as a liberal dystopia characterized by homelessness, high taxes, and government dysfunction. By elevating fraud allegations, even when many are years old or already being addressed, the administration keeps California's problems in the news cycle, potentially damaging Newsom's national brand. Second, it allows Trump to frame himself as a champion of taxpayer protection and government accountability, traditionally popular positions across the political spectrum. The optics of a vice president leading an anti-fraud crusade appeal to voters frustrated with government waste, even if the underlying reality is more complex. Third, it creates a template for federal pressure on Democratic governors in swing states. If the administration can successfully paint Democratic governance as synonymous with fraud and mismanagement, it potentially impacts gubernatorial and Senate races in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin during the 2026 midterms. Political communications expert Dan Schnur of USC and UC Berkeley told the Los Angeles Times that California is a particularly ripe target for Republicans because Democrats have controlled the state legislature and governor's office for years. With Democrats holding supermajorities in both houses and no Republican elected statewide since 2006, Republicans bear no responsibility for California's governance, making it easier to deploy as a political punching bag. Newsom, for his part, has pushed back aggressively, highlighting fraud issues in Republican-led states and questioning why those aren't receiving similar federal scrutiny. He's characterized the investigation as polarization, politicalization, weaponization, and filed a civil rights complaint after Dr. Mehmet Oz, the Medicare administrator, made what Newsom called baseless and racist allegations against Armenian Americans while investigating hospice fraud in Los Angeles. As we look ahead, several key questions will determine whether this task force becomes a substantive reform effort or a partisan political exercise. First, methodology and transparency. Will the task force use rigorous, consistent methodologies that could be applied to all states, or will it deploy standards selectively? Will findings be made public in detail, or will we receive only politically convenient summary conclusions? Second, proportionality. Will the scale of federal intervention match the scale of actual fraud, or will legitimate state efforts to address these issues be ignored in favor of dramatic federal action? California has already recovered billions and prosecuted hundreds. Will that receive acknowledgement or only condemnation for the fraud that occurred? Third, precedent. If this task force finds success, however defined, will future administrations use similar structures to target opposition party states? Are we establishing a new normal where federal power is wielded as a political weapon against state governments of the opposite party? Fourth, timing and fiscal reality. California faces significant budget challenges. Estimates range from a $3 billion to $18 billion shortfall, depending on whose projections you trust. Any fraud identified could be framed as either vindication of Republican criticism or as money that could help close budget gaps. How state lawmakers respond will be politically consequential. And finally, the 2028 presidential implications. If Newsom emerges relatively unscathed, or if he successfully positions himself as a fighter against federal overreach, this could strengthen his presidential credentials. Conversely, if damaging findings emerge, particularly new revelations beyond what's already known, it could torpedo his national ambitions before they truly begin. What we're witnessing is governance and politics inextricably intertwined. Yes, California has experienced significant fraud. Yes, accountability matters and taxpayers deserve protection. But the selective targeting, the timing, the structure, and the personalities involved all suggest this is simultaneously, perhaps even primarily, about the 2026 midterms and the 2028 presidential race. As analysts, our job is to watch how this unfolds with clear eyes, distinguishing legitimate oversight from political theater and substantive findings from recycled allegations. The executive order could drop any day now. When it does, read it carefully. Look for the details on scope, methodology, oversight, and reporting requirements. Those details will tell us whether this is serious fraud enforcement or sophisticated political warfare. Thank you for watching. I'll continue tracking this story as it develops, and I encourage you to follow the evidence, not just the rhetoric. Until next time.